Chapter 2 A Great Aviator. 8-year-old Betty Greene pushed a strand of long brown hair out of her eyes and peered upward for a glimpse of the spirit of St. Louis. She had read everything she could about Charles Lindbergh and his amazing flight from Long Island, New York, to Paris. She had to pinch herself to remind herself she really was in the stadium at the University of Washington, waiting with thousands of other excited people for her hero to fly overhead. Betty wiggled a little closer to her oldest brother, Joe. Even though Joe was 16 years old, Betty felt they were buddies. After all, the two of them shared a love for airplanes. Joe already had a pilot's license, having flown solo at 14, and Betty could hardly wait to follow in his footsteps. An eerie hush fell over the crowd. Then Betty heard it, the buzz of an airplane engine in the distance. The sound grew steadily louder. Betty squinted into the sun until she finally saw the plane come into view. The tiny single-engine monoplane glistened in the sunlight. On each side of its nose, the words Spirit of St. Louis were painted in blue script lettering, and the call letters NX211 were emblazoned on the underside of the right wing. Betty gazed in amazement as the plane circled the stadium 3 times. Her imagination ran wild. She was actually looking at the first airplane ever to fly nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean. She had followed the attempts of other pilots to be the first to make the 3,600-mile nonstop flight. Commander David had crashed his plane in a trial flight, killing himself and his co-pilot. Captain Neuengesser, a French pilot, had taken off from Paris in a biplane and was never seen again. But now, right overhead, were the airplane and the pilot who had made the 33.5-hour flight on May 22, 1927. After a final tip of its wings, the airplane climbed and headed southwest. "Where is it going?" Betty asked Joe. "To Sandpoint Naval Air Station," he replied. "Lindbergh is going to land there, and then a motorcade will bring him back to the stadium. See that stand down there?" He pointed to a large wooden platform decorated with red, white, and blue ribbons. "That's where he will give a speech and receive his medal from the city of Seattle." Betty turned to her twin brother Bill and relayed the thrilling news to him. Bill nodded, though Betty was sure he would be thinking more about the car Lindbergh arrived in than the airplane he'd flown across the Atlantic. Despite being born only 8 minutes apart, Bill did not share Betty's interest in airplanes, though they enjoyed and did almost everything else together. They gathered wild blackberries from the bushes at the edge of Lake Washington, which formed the western boundary of the Greene family's property. They were in the same class at Hunts Point School, and being the youngest, they were both fed and bathed by Josephine, the family maid, who tucked them safely into bed each night before their father arrived home from the office at 6 p.m. One thing the Greene twins did not lack was plenty of fresh air, sunshine, and sleep. At last Betty heard the honking of horns. All those around her rose to their feet, chanting, "Lindbergh! Lindbergh!" and waving souvenir flags with the famous aviator's face on them. Some people wore hats with shiny, commemorative buttons on them, or carried tiny dolls dressed in pilot's leathers. Betty stood on her tiptoes, squeezed between Joe and her other brother, 12-year-old Albert. She tried to peer through the sea of hats that blocked her view. She couldn't see a thing. Finally, she looked up at Joe with tears stinging her brown eyes. With an understanding look, Joe scooped her up and held her above the crowd so that she could see. Suddenly, there he was, the greatest aviator of the time. Charles Lindbergh had arrived. He looked like an overgrown, gangly schoolboy. Betty was surprised, as she had expected someone who looked older and wiser, like her father. Lucky Lindbergh, as he had been nicknamed, sat in the back seat of a big open car, grinning from ear to ear. As he drove past, no more than 15 feet from her, Betty could make out the distinguished flying cross pinned to the left side of his jacket that President Coolidge had presented to him. The cheering and applause of the crowd finally died down, and the speeches began. Betty couldn't follow all that was said. It was a blur of information about the Ryan plane Lindbergh had flown, how safe it was, and how flying was the future for America. Charles Lindbergh also said something about America having an airport in every city and town someday. It all sounded far-fetched to Betty, but she hoped it was true. There was nothing she wanted to do more than fly. In the following years, Other, more important concerns occupied Betty's mind. In May of 1928, the Greene family suffered through a disaster. The twins, Betty and Bill, were at a birthday party for one of their second grade classmates. As Betty's mother, Gertrude Greene, was helping to serve the cake, the telephone rang. Mrs. Greene answered it, and Betty watched as her mother's face fell. She knew something was wrong. Yes, yes, thank you, I understand, she heard her mother say just before she put the phone down and ran outside. The entire birthday party followed her. They all rushed to the side of the road, where about a quarter of a mile away they could see flames shooting high into the air. A fire! Yelled one of the children in delight. Betty did not share the boys' excitement. Her stomach was tied in knots. It was her house that was engulfed in flames. Later that night, when the embers had cooled, the Greene family inspected what had once been their spacious home, now a pile of blackened wood. Grotesque, twisted skeletons of their furniture lay scattered among the ruins. Betty could make out the bed springs where her bed had been and a broken piece of her favorite doll china tea set. Nothing was left except two lawn chairs that had been on the back porch. Someone had dashed up and rescued them. Evergreen Point's only firefighting equipment, a hose pushcart, had been no match for the fire that engulfed the tinder-dry, solid cedar home. Thankfully, a small cottage was on the property, and the Greene family crammed into it for the time being. Friends and neighbors brought clothes and kitchen items, and before long, life felt almost normal again. However, an even bigger disaster was brewing across America. October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, as it came to be known, was a tragic day for many people, who on that day discovered that the stocks and bonds they'd invested in had lost their value. The Wall Street crash had begun. Financial panic gripped the nation. The wheels of industry ground to a halt as the price of everything, from produce to machinery, collapsed. Unemployment spread throughout the country as rapidly as fire had through the Greenes' home. America was in shock. Most people had thought the good years following World War I would go on forever. Now they were suddenly plunged into what became known as the Great Depression. Betty Greene was 9 years old at the time, and although she didn't understand much about stocks and bonds, she knew for certain that some things had changed. Her father now came home from work with a worried look on his face. Albert Greene owned a small business called Greene Electric Furnace Company. He had developed a special design for making arc furnaces for steel mills, which he sold to the biggest steel manufacturers in the country. When the economy collapsed, people stopped buying new cars and other items made of steel. This meant that there was no demand for steel, and so the manufacturers had no reason to buy Mr. Greene's new furnaces for their mills. The Great Depression also meant that Josephine, the family maid, had to be dismissed. In her place, Betty's mother did all the housework herself. As well, the new 7-passenger V8 Lincoln touring car Mr. Greene had just purchased was put up on wooden blocks in the garage. The family could no longer afford to buy gasoline for it. Both Betty and Bill got summer jobs to help their mother pay for groceries. One summer, they picked cherries for several weeks. The pay wasn't great, just 75 cents a week, but they got to eat as many cherries as they could, and then some. Betty, who loved animals, found a small black and white dog in the cherry orchard. The dog attached itself to her, and soon Betty had a new friend, which she named Shep. Mr. Greene had been wise with his money, and the Greene family were better off than many others. Betty and Bill continued to go to school, and even though their clothes were no longer new, they always looked well cared for. In 6th grade, the twins had a teacher from Germany. The teacher loved to read to the class, especially books about air warfare during World War I, and how German and English pilots in their flimsy biplanes had engaged in dogfights. Betty loved to listen to these stories, not so much the bits about the shooting and bombings, but about the planes soaring high in the air, looping and doing daring acrobats. As she sat listening to the teacher read, she had no idea that one day she would be a pilot in another war. Shep, the stray dog, followed Betty and Bill everywhere, and it made Betty yearn for more pets. In particular, she had her sights set on a horse. The family's 2-acre property, which sloped down to Lake Washington, had plenty of room for a horse, but there was not enough money for one. Eventually, Betty won out, and her parents agreed to buy her a horse if she promised to take good care of it. Dixie cost $8, and Betty faithfully shoveled out the barn and spread hay for her every day. She also loved to ride Dixie, especially since her mother allowed her to wear jodhpurs instead of the skirts and dresses she had to wear the rest of the time. Betty would gallop Dixie down the dusty back roads, stopping along the way to talk to friends from the Sunday school her parents oversaw. She also loaned Dixie to Bill so that he could deliver the Saturday Evening Post to about 50 families on a 5-mile route around the neighborhood. When she wasn't riding, Betty spent her time reading or going to the movies. So many interesting things were happening in the world. In 1928, Amelia Earhart had become the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean as a passenger, but it was still considered a daring feat, and she had followed that up with several adventurous solo flights in the United States. In 1929, Richard Byrd and Bernt Balkin had become the first two people to fly to the South Pole. Of course, reading about all these aviators' accomplishments just made Betty yearn to fly even more. On her 16th birthday, Betty finally got her wish. Her father arranged for her and Bill to take an airplane ride. Flying was all Betty had imagined it would be and more. She was hooked. That same birthday, her uncle gave the twins $100 each. That was a lot of money, and the two of them agonized over what to do with it. Bill eventually decided to save his for college, but Betty knew she wanted to take flying lessons more than anything else. Her parents agreed to let her use most of the money for that purpose, as long as she used a portion of it to buy herself some new clothes. Within days, Betty was bumping down the runway with her instructor, Elliot Merrill, at the controls. She watched everything he did, from the way he worked the rudder with his feet to how he set the flaps for takeoff and landing. 2 weeks later, Betty was flying solo and enjoying every moment of it, although she never got as far as earning her private pilot's license before her money ran out. Now that they were 16 years old, school was coming to an end for the Greene twins. It was time for them to make some serious career choices. Bill had always planned to attend California Institute of Technology to earn an engineering degree, as his father had, but even with a partial scholarship, there simply wasn't enough money in the family budget. Instead, Bill settled for studying mining engineering at the nearby University of Washington. Betty, who had hoped to attend a women's college, was also forced to choose the University of Washington, which she could attend while still living at home. The question was, what should she study? Mrs. Greene had very definite ideas about what her daughter should pursue. She believed nursing was a suitable career for a young woman. It was useful and socially acceptable. Betty wasn't so convinced. She loved animals and airplanes and dreamed of having a career involving either or both of these. But what kind of job? Eventually, Betty gave in and let her mother have her way. She entered the University of Washington to study for a bachelor's degree in science with a nursing major. It was the winter of 1937, and it looked to 17-year-old Betty as if a predictable future had been neatly laid out for her. Little did she know what adventures lay just around the corner.